Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Blumenthal. I'm with the American Enterprise Institute. I do Asian affairs here, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event. We're thrilled to have on his way, doing important work in the Senate, Senator Dan Sullivan, who has taken a leadership role on Asia-Pacific issues, as well as a host of other issues, has executive branch experience as well in the National Security Council and the State Department, and has been tasked as a member of the Armed Services Committee to actually oversee the Asia rebalance. And so very important work. He'll be here any minute. And then we have AEI's own Derek Scissors, who is our international economist and focuses on Asia issues from an international economic standpoint, as well as Ambassador John Bolton, probably well known to all of you, with vast experience as a diplomat and policymaker over the course of many years, and a scholar here at AEI, as well as many other positions he holds in public life. So what I thought I would do is, we have, at least Ambassador Bolton has a hard stop at 2, so we're going to try to move expeditiously. But we're going to start actually with Derek Scissors. Is that right? Is that what we wanted to do?
Okay.
Yeah. Derek Scissors, who's going to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, as well as some of the energy issues, which are of great interest to all of us, but to Senator Sullivan in particular as well. So let's start with Derek.
All right. I actually read the entire Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, so I could filibuster for the entire time we're here and not even scratch the surface. If I'm giving short attention to your issues, please understand I want to speak for no more than 10 minutes, and it's very complicated. There are multiple dimensions of Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't like it as a free trade agreement. I understand that there are commercial benefits. There certainly are upon my read of the text. There are also very important diplomatic benefits, and other people seated up here and out in the audience can say that the diplomatic and leadership benefits of the United States are more important than the economic benefits, and that's a good conversation to have. I'm going to stick to economics first off and say there's a pretty heavy burden on the TPP. What's the other trade initiative in town? There's a regional comprehensive economic partnership that excludes the United States, and I always say that's never going to go anywhere, and my proof is India is in it. And that's the end of my discussion of the regional comprehensive economic partnership. The WTO has had tremendous difficulty doing even very limited tasks. The trade and investment partnership the U.S. is exploring with Europe is well behind the TPP in schedule, and in fact would be based in large part on the TPP. So there's a very heavy burden on TPP, and the burden, from my standpoint as an economist, is to advance free trade, and that burden it does not meet. There are benefits in agriculture to the United States and in free trade and agriculture. There are improvements in protection of intellectual property. I am not for a moment saying the TPP has nothing to offer. It does have things to offer. But for example, we would very much like the TPP to liberalize services trade. The U.S. is a very competitive services provider, so are some other parties of the TPP. Services trade is much more protectionist than goods trade around the world. And the TPP, if you look at the services chapters, looks like it liberalizes services trade. Unfortunately, if you get to the annex on non-conforming measures, where non-conforming measures are exceptions that countries take to the treaty terms, where they say we don't have to abide by these terms, non-conforming measures annex is about this high. I know, I had to stare at them for days. And they wipe out most of the gains that the treaty offers in financial and transport services. So someone just reading the chapter is going to see a much more positive impression of the TPP than will actually occur in practice. Similarly, the rules of origin of the TPP are not terrible from a free trade standpoint. They're not wildly restrictive, but they're too complicated. And again, the TPP's burden here is these are going to be the rules of origin. Rules of origin are determine whether a good or service counts as part of the agreement because it's produced by one of the members, or it's been transshipped from some other country, and it doesn't count as part of the agreement. It can't be treated under those terms. That's what rules of origin means. If the rules of origins are complicated in the TPP, what's going to happen when we add countries to the TPP? What's going to happen when we add a European agreement on top of it? You really had a high standard to meet in the TPP on rules of origin to make them simple and usable, and it didn't meet it. And what happens when you have complex rules of origin is companies don't know how to behave. The agreement exists on paper, but they don't know how to meet the terms of the agreement. And customs agents don't know how to administer the agreement. So you have an agreement on paper and not in practice. This is something that happens in trade agreements around the world. And the last objection I would have doesn't concern the TPP itself so much as the precedent it sets. It involves competitive neutrality or the treatment of state-owned enterprises. And the treatment of state-owned enterprises is weak, and there's no other way around it. Countries that want to have a very small state sector, don't want state-owned enterprises to interfere with competition, they're fine. But they were mostly fine before. It's the countries that want to try to game the TPP terms, that want state-owned enterprises to be a force in their trade. They can easily do so. The state-owned enterprise chapter does not limit those kinds of predatory countries. So I see these flaws in the TPP, and even though I see diplomatic benefits, I have concerns about American leadership as a result.
Just in time to save the TPP.
Ambassador,
Good to see you. Derek was just defending the TPP.
No, I was not.
Excellent.
A very brief recapitulation. The TPP does have diplomatic benefits. It also has commercial benefits, but it is not a sound free trade agreement. And from the United States perspective, we've always been the leader on free trade. If we set a precedent for mediocre trade agreements, no one will pick up the slack. We'll be looking at a more and more inadequate free trade environment as time goes on. Therefore, I see, even though I see the benefits to U.S. leadership of the TPP, I see the long-term costs as being larger. Two other things I want to talk about with regard to Asia. One is U.S. economic relations with China. The other is U.S. economic relations with India. In India, I think the U.S. is being short-sighted in some of its approach to India. We are emphasizing market access and bilateral issues too much, and the progress of the Indian economy towards being a booming economy too little. I won't tell American businesses what they should do in India. I would just simply raise a strategic economic counterpoint. Today's India is not what the United States is looking for as a partner economically or politically. We're looking for a rapidly growing, prosperous India that has seen 10, 15 years of strong growth. That India can exist. Doesn't exist now. Today's India is poor. We don't want a poor India. We want a middle income and growing India. Those changes don't come from getting more access to American companies. They come from fundamental changes within India about land and labor laws. They come from shrinking the role of the Indian state, which is extremely inefficient. That's what the United States should be emphasizing in our relationship with India, not short-term bilateral gains. I understand that there are short-term bilateral gains to be had. I wouldn't deny that talking to the business community. But from a leadership standpoint, from a U.S.-Asia relations standpoint, we need a booming India. And a booming India comes from domestic Indian reforms. That's what we should be encouraging as our top priority. Finally, on the Chinese side, I think the evidence is mixed and incomplete, but the preponderance says this is not a good Chinese government to negotiate with. We are right now, and the Obama administration seems intent on drafting a bilateral investment treaty with China. This is after several years of the Chinese treating American firms worse. Not better, not the same. They've treated American firms worse. Why are you signing a bilateral investment treaty with a country that appears to be committed to treating your companies worse than they used to? That's not the way. You don't reward bad behavior like that. So China is a very important relationship, and I certainly don't accept and I entirely disagree with the bomb throwing that occurs sometimes during election season, that we should slap 30% tariffs on China or anything of the sort. But I do think we might want to step away from the idea that progress in the U.S.-China economic relationship is both possible and desirable. China needs to show that it's a good partner, and I don't think it is. It's showing it's a big partner, it's an important partner. There are areas in the U.S.-China relationship that greatly benefit the United States. Those are all true. But this government came in committed to a form of China-first mercantilism, and remains committed, in my point of view, that does not make for a good bilateral investment treaty or other relationships the U.S. had with China. So I do not want to destroy the U.S.-China economic relationship. That is a terrible idea. But I also want to try to de-emphasize it. Until we see better performance out of China as an economic partner, that improving our economic relationship with China should not be a focal point of America's approach to Asia. I have at least one fan on that point. I want to give time, make sure we have time for the real reason we're here. And I'm last on that list, so I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Derek, and welcome to AI, Senator.
Thanks, Dan.
Where you have a free trader critiquing a free trade agreement, and a couple national security types who are probably for it. But I had introduced you already as someone who is playing an important role in overseeing the rebalance and very focused on economic, energy, and armed services issues. And obviously, part of what we want to discuss today is is how the three kind of impinge upon each other, and no other region does it do so. So let me turn it over to you.
Great. Well, listen, first, thank you, and I apologize, everybody. You know, the traffic gets a little stuck here when there's a tiny bit of rain. In Alaska, we're not used to that, right? We deal with 12 inches of snow and plow through. It's great to see Ambassador Bolton here. Derek, I had dinner with Derek the other night. I'm glad to see he still keeps his opinions kind of below the radar and not very forceful. But I just want to thank you and AEI. I mean, what you guys do. I was at the dinner the other night when Prime Minister Netanyahu was there, saw Ambassador Bolton, a whole bunch of my colleagues were there. And what you do in terms of public service, these kind of forums, these kind of debates, I just want to start by thanking you and, again, apologizing for being a little bit late. I'll start with just kind of talking a little bit about, you know, I've had the opportunity in my career to see the Asia-Pacific relationship between the United States from a number of different perspectives. I've deployed out in the region as a U.S. Marine, still serving in the reserves, and I can talk about some of our experiences out there in different parts, at least from my perspective, as a young lieutenant infantry officer many, many years ago, but still kind of informs some of the things that I saw out there, being deployed in Okinawa, being part of the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996. And so some of that experience, I served in the Bush administration as an Assistant Secretary of State with a lot of focus on Asia, a lot of focus on China. Importantly, and I don't think a lot of times in Washington you get this perspective, but in Alaska, I was the Attorney General and then the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy in my state. And so I spent a fair amount of time in Asia in that capacity, because Asia, for my state, you know, in Alaska is an Asia-Pacific state. We have parts of Alaska that are further west than Hawaii is. It's a huge market for us, huge, and we're a big export powerhouse, even though from a population perspective, we're a small state. A huge part of our economic future is in Asia. So as a state official, I spent a lot of time out there. And then also as a senator, someone who's taken a lot of interest. I've already had a couple of CODELs that I've been on in the Asia Pacific. So as you mentioned, I have taken a lot of interest, particularly on the Armed Services Committee, but in other capacities on the rebalance and the Obama administration's rebalance. I've talked a fair amount, you know, a lot of people talk about that in terms of two different areas. The military side, what we're doing from a military perspective in terms of the rebalance. Obviously, the economic and trade side. I was somebody who voted for and actually worked hard to try and round up the votes on a trade promotion authority, which I thought was important from a strategic perspective. Every president since President Reagan essentially has had TPA. I am withholding judgment, of course, right now. We just got it, the TPP. And I'm certainly digging into that. Actually had a team from USTR over briefing my team and myself just a couple days ago. So doing the due diligence that I think the American people would want their representatives in Congress to do on an agreement of this magnitude, this importance. But I will also say that I like to talk about the rebalance in terms of another prong that often gets overlooked, and that's energy. And the huge opportunities that we have in this country with regard to energy. You know, we would have never talked about this 10 or 15 years ago, but the United States right now, once again, occupies the position that we have traditionally occupied. We just took a 3 or 4 decade hiatus from it, and that's the world's energy superpower. We are the biggest producer of oil, again, in the world. Bigger than Saudi Arabia. Biggest producer of natural gas, again, in the world, bigger than Russia, biggest producer of renewables. And this, in my view, creates enormous opportunities for deepening our strategic relationship with Asian nations with regard to our energy, and also dramatically helping the U.S. economy, workers. And so to me, when I think about the rebalance, it's trade, it's economics, it's military, but it should also include energy. And I've been pressing everybody in the Obama administration on the importance of that. Large-scale LNG exports to Asia, I think, would dramatically help us, help our allies like Japan and Korea. And even countries, I had a dinner last night, the Singapore ambassador was there, you know, they're looking to be a possible hub for LNG and oil trading throughout the Asia Pacific. If we can be a huge part of that, I think that will enhance our security, it'll enhance our economic opportunities, and it'll enhance the security of our allies in the region. I'll just end my opening remarks with one important comment. And Ambassador Bolton has probably done better than anybody in terms of talking about American credibility in terms of foreign policy. How our credibility, in many ways, is the coin of the realm in terms of what we do from a foreign policy and national security perspective. U.S. credibility, and you know, we're not going to talk probably about the Middle East or Iran or Ukraine, but in my view, our credibility from a foreign policy perspective is in decline. I think is putting it diplomatically. I think you might even call it in tatters in a lot of areas in the world. The good news, I think, is that with regard to credibility in the Asia Pacific, it's not reached that kind of low, at least from my perspective. Sometimes it's hard to keep credibility in one part of the world, not impacting it in another. But I still think that you have, by and large, a strategy that's happening in the Asia Pacific in terms of the broader rebalance that's supported by not only the executive branch, but by most of the legislative branch, which is, of course, is when American foreign policy and national security is at its strongest, when it's supported by both key branches of government. That's not what you're seeing in many other parts of the world. It's still bipartisan for the most part, but there have been instances where I've been worried that we're going to start to have, even in the Asia Pacific, some Syria red line type of incidences which would undermine our credibility in the region. And that's something, as a senator, I've been very focused on, been trying to encourage the administration when it says something, like when Ash Carter gave a strong speech out at the Shangri-La Dialogue, all the defense ministers out in Singapore last spring, that we needed to follow up on that speech with action, not just words. And that eventually happened, but it took a lot of prodding, and I think in some ways we need to maintain a strong, credible foreign policy in this part of the world, and there are times when I think that that's a concern.
Well, thank you, Senator. And I just, to kind of bring some of these, by the way, they're all clapping for you. For us. So what I certainly was. But what I wanted to sort of bring things together, and perhaps, Ambassador Bolton, you can address this, is this question of credibility. If you're looking in China right now, and okay, we've announced a rebalance and we've announced a pivot. Or first we announced a pivot and then we changed it to a rebalance.
Then we changed it to a pirouette.
Whatever it is. So you look at things like the TPP, which is out there now, but maybe, or as flawed as it may be. You look at things like military issues and the way our defense budget is going and our posture is going. And I don't mean to ask too much of a leading question. But, and then these other issues of energy exports and so on. I mean, do you think China perceives us as kind of declining and less credible as a sort of strong competitor, or how do you see that?
Yeah. Well, first, let me thank Senator Sullivan for coming and joining us today, and we're delighted that you're here, and I hope it'll augur well for the future to have a standing invitation as far as we're concerned. And
I will take you up on that, Ambassador. Thank you.
But we're delighted you're here. You know, I think the United States, I completely agree, has a credibility problem broadly in the international community under this administration, and I fear it's only going to grow worse for the next year plus. In Asia in particular, I think there are huge strategic issues at stake for the United States, for its friends and allies in the region and beyond. And I think part of the problem is that is the administration, but I think there's a larger problem in the United States as well, which I'd like to address quickly. And then, rather than talk about what probably most people here want to hear about, which is the South China Sea. I want to talk about North Korea for a minute, because I think for 7 years nearly we haven't talked about North Korea, and I think that's a big mistake. This is the problem from the U.S. perspective with respect to China. I think the dominant view in the American government, in the key national security agencies, and I think the dominant view in American business is a view of China that has been expressed by many people in speeches. You will all recognize what I'm referring to. This is the view that China is pursuing a peaceful rise, get that phrase, peaceful rise, and that China will be a responsible stakeholder, underline responsible stakeholder, in international affairs. And the entire panoply of policies that the United States has to pursue across the political, military, economic range are all colored by this view of China. Now, I think that is the happiest view of China's policies. It may be the most desirable from the United States point of view, but it's not the only scenario. And in fact, I think it's not even the most likely scenario for what China's up to. And I think, in fact, it's increasingly diverging from the reality of what's happening in the region. China is pursuing a host of policies that are completely contrary to the notion of a peaceful rise, and is hardly acting like a responsible stakeholder in the South China Sea, in what it's doing in the East China Sea and what it may threaten to do, but also with respect to North Korea. And I want to give the example of North Korea because I think the Obama administration has not pursued any strategy at all, particularly about North Korea's nuclear weapons program. This inaction has been called strategic patience, which is almost an oxymoron in my perspective. The North Koreans have been proceeding with their nuclear program. There's every reason to believe that the close cooperation between North Korea and Iran on ballistic missiles, which they've engaged in since at least 1998, if not before, also applies in the nuclear area. And while you can at least say under the Obama administration they haven't made concessions to North Korea, substantial ones anyway, in the past 7 years, unlike the last couple of years of the Bush administration, just watching North Korea continue to advance in the nuclear and ballistic missile field shouldn't give us any reason to be optimistic. And in fact, just in past months, we've seen the commander of U.S. forces, Korea, the Pacific Command, and counterparts in South Korea all say basically the same thing about North Korea's increasingly developing capability to miniaturize its nuclear devices, put it in a warhead, put it on a ballistic missile, and in a relatively short period of time hit targets, at least on the west coast of the United States. And I think what North Korea can do with its missile capability, Iran will be able to do simultaneously. Now, let's look at China's policy here, really extending back almost 15 years. China says that it opposes North Korea having nuclear weapons because that capability in the hands of the North Korean regime destabilizes East Asia, and instability in East Asia is adverse to Chinese economic development, which is its highest priority. So therefore, China would like to see the end of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. Now, I think that policy from China's point of view is eminently sensible. They're correct. It's not a good thing to have North Korea with a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. But for the last 15 years, they have done essentially nothing to achieve that objective. They have, it is true, hosted the six-party talks, which has been a movable feast of diplomats visiting the great capitals of East Asia and other places in endless consultations. It's resulted in agreements that have had no material effect on North Korea's capability. And it's masked the reality that, in fact, it's China that does have a veto over North Korea's very existence. The evidence we have is that China supplies something in the range of 90% of North Korea's energy. It supplies huge amounts of food and other basic human needs, not because humanitarianism has overwhelmed the leaders in Beijing, but because they want to keep the North Koreans in North Korea, not have them cross the Yalu. And China has simply failed to exercise this leverage to stop the North Korean nuclear program. So you ask, well, why? If they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, and if now 15 years of negotiations have not produced any inclination by North Korea not to continue with that program, why does China say one thing but pursue policies that permit the opposite to happen? And I think the reason is much the same with respect to Iran's nuclear weapons program for both China and Russia, that while China doesn't like North Korea with nuclear weapons, they basically don't think it's their problem. They think it's our problem. And they think it's Japan's problem and for others around the region. That the instability is a concern for everybody else, not so much for China. And that, to me, is either an extraordinarily misguided policy on China's part or extremely cynical. And when we see the actions that China takes in the South China Sea of purporting to be engaged in a diplomatic effort to resolve competing territorial claims, but by, in fact, not just, as we say in the Middle East, creating facts on the ground, but creating the ground itself that undercut everybody else's territorial claims, the argument for cynicism dominating Chinese policy is pretty hard to reject. Now, I think within China there is dissent on that prospect when it comes to North Korea. I think among some of the younger thinkers and leaders, there's an appreciation that North Korea is a pretty ugly piece of baggage to have to carry around, and that ultimately the reunification of the Korean Peninsula under a democratic government is the most effective way to eliminate the North Korean nuclear weapons program, eliminate that source of instability, and really give China ultimately an advantage as it's had historically over the Korean Peninsula. We're doing nothing to try and take advantage of that. I think that's a strategic failure on our part. But I think the basic problem still lies in Beijing, that they are saying one thing and doing another, and we're at this point too gullible to take them up on it. And as long as that persists, not only with respect to North Korea, but across a wide range of other areas where the U.S. and China come into contact or competition, it's just sowing the seeds for a much more difficult relationship in the coming decades. So I'm quite worried about this because I think America's operating under one illusion, China's pursuing a different direction, and this is going to lead to trouble, I'm afraid, in fairly short order.
Senator, I wanted to ask you, thanks a lot, Ambassador Bolton, but I wanted to ask you, you know, I've learned anything, Asia's a big place, right? As soon as you start talking about the South China Sea or the East China Sea or Taiwan, you forget that North Korea is, at your peril, you forget North Korea is acquiring more nuclear weapons and not standing still. So there is this question. We have a new president going to come in no matter what in 2017, and we have a set of issues in Asia. We have this island building campaign. We have these pressing on maritime claims. We have the TPP, which all of you will get the opportunity to vote on, I think, next year.
Maybe.
Maybe. You know, we have issues.
Did he come out against the TPP? Did I miss that?
Yeah.
He's coming out against a vote on it, I guess.
No.
And these issues of relative economic strength, and of course these issues of U.S. posture, and as you said before, another tool in our toolkit, energy. How would you stack these up? What would you recommend that we do in terms of our priorities? Is you know, to put us in a better place on any number of these issues?
Well, look, you know, one of the other things I've had the opportunity to do during the past year, given my focus on Asia-Pacific issues, is to meet with a number of the different leaders. When Prime Minister Abe was here, and then when I was in Tokyo, I had the opportunity to meet with him. I did have the opportunity with a small number of senators to meet with President Xi Jinping when he was in town. So before that meeting, I went to the floor of the Senate and just wasn't some kind of grand speech, but just laid out some ideas like what you were talking about, Dan, in terms of looking at our challenges and then our opportunities in the Asia Pacific. And of course, the broader strategic challenge that I think most people recognize is how to look at, view, and deal with the rise of China. As some of you may have read, Ambassador Bolton's referring to Bob Zellick's very well-received speech, gosh, now over 10 years ago, the responsible stakeholder speech, which was essentially encouraging them to be responsible stakeholders, and that was an idea that's been out there for now a decade. Some of you may have seen Graham Allison wrote an article, I think, in the Atlantic about the Thucydides trap and kind of the whole idea, if you look at kind of the, Peloponnesian War and how Thucydides wrote about that, a rising power challenging an established large power. If you look historically, that has not always ended up very well. A lot of times the historical examples that he looks in this article, more often than not, end up in conflict. And so what I did before this meeting, I laid out a couple things that I think we should be thinking about. Number one is we do have a tremendous network of allies in the region that we have developed over the course of 70 years, at least. And for the most part, most of these allies still look at the United States as the key country in the region. And what's very interesting to me, and I saw a little bit of example of this when we were, again, in Singapore. I was with Senator McCain, Jack Reed, Joni Ernst, and Secretary Carter was there. We met with him. But we were also having a number of bilateral meetings with defense ministers, foreign ministers from a whole host of countries in the region. And what was clear to me is that the rise of China and the island building in the South China Sea was not creating some kind of gravitational pull towards China by our traditional allies or countries that are not even our traditional allies, like Vietnam, but it's creating a pull and a desire for most of these countries to tuck in more closely to the United States. And you may have seen there's been articles recently. I saw one in the Financial Times recently about there's this talk of the United States pivot to Asia, but in India they're talking about an Indian pivot to Washington for the same reasons. So we do have a network and a history of alliances and countries that trust us. And in my view, the dynamics in the region are such that they're trusting us and looking to us for leadership even more. In countries that have traditionally not been strong allies or even in the American orbit, like Vietnam, like India, are starting to be very interested in deepening the relationship with the United States. That's an advantage. That's an opportunity, certainly. The other thing I mentioned was that, we're not great, certainly in a lot of places in our own country in terms of history, understanding the history of the region, understanding what drives the different forces in the region. And, we have laid out long-term strategies before that have been successful. Everybody talks about the strategy of containment launched by, George Kennan. But we do have the capability when we're serious in forums like this with, ambassadors and think tank members to help us as a country put together long-term strategies. And we need to do that in the Asia Pacific. And finally, the thing I mentioned, which to be honest is one of the biggest surprises that I've seen as a new senator in Washington, is how often the critical issue of economic growth never gets discussed. It's never even mentioned. And of course that's a domestic issue, but it is an enormous issue with regard to our foreign policy and national security, particularly in Asia. we are now growing, on average, each quarter about 1.5% GDP growth. That was last quarter. First quarter this year, we shrunk by 0.9%. We actually went back into recession. And yet you don't see anyone, the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, the President of the United States, coming out saying, don't worry, America. We know that that's not our normal traditional levels of growth. We know that over the last 100 years, the U.S. economy has grown almost at about a 4% clip. And now, we can't even break 2. And nobody talks about it. Not only they don't talk about it, they dumb it down. And they call it, it's the new normal. The new normal. Well, I think that's one of the most dangerous concepts I've seen since I've gotten to Washington. We should not accept 2% GDP growth at all, or 1.5%. We need to be doing things that can grow this economy and unleash the private sector. If we are growing at 4% GDP growth, our leverage in terms of strategy in the Asia Pacific will be enormously enhanced. And that's the third element that I said we need to think about as a country as we look at these challenges and opportunities in the Asia Pacific.
Thanks. Really quick before I open it up to questions. For Derek, do you think we're perceived by China as economically stagnant and on the way down? How do you think we're perceived on those issues?
Well, I completely agree with what the Senator just said in terms of leveraging the Asia Pacific. I'm not a big fan of GDP growth as a measure, but a vibrant U.S. economy does open up strategic opportunities for us, and they can't be found anywhere else. Everything else is management, which we need to do better, and Ambassador Bolton knows much more about that than I do. But what choices you have, the door is opened by economics. And the better we do on the economic front and the more we cast off the idea that this is the way it is and we can't do any better, the better we'll do with Asia, even if our management level is not where we want it to be. So I completely agree with the Senator. I think the way the Chinese look at us is framed by the way the Chinese look at themselves. They thought that some elements in China were worried about this and some were happy, but I would say a majority of Chinese following the U.S. economy and communicating with policymakers thought the Lehman shock and the financial crisis really was a serious threat to U.S. economic leadership, and that this was an opportunity for China, a dangerous one because the world economy was so rocky, but an opportunity for China to move into that maybe co-leadership role or leadership in Asia on the economic side. And that's not what's happened. We've outperformed China since the financial crisis. I mean, there are lots of different ways to look at it. You can use reported Chinese GDP growth and then say, well, they've grown faster in GDP terms. I'm not sure that's true. I also don't care. The stock of national wealth in the United States has wildly eclipsed the stock of national wealth in China. And that's what you do to support your strategic initiatives, your military, if necessary, war fighting with North Korea or whoever else. So 2009 was a very bad year for the U.S. and if you're in the rivalry sense, a good year for China. But the last 5 years, I think the way the Chinese look at the U.S. is that China doesn't have a shale revolution. They're not catching up technologically because the U.S. is a highly innovative country. They look at the U.S. as doing okay, not great, and they're worried about how China's doing in comparison. And I think we've seen that pretty explicitly from the party. The third plenary meeting in 2013 was fixing the Chinese economy. Premier Li walks around saying reform will be like cutting the wrists. If the Chinese thought they were outperforming the world and the world economic leader, we wouldn't hear that kind of talk.
Thanks. Finally, Ambassador Bolton, in terms of thinking about China differently, if Derek is correct, and I have no reason to believe he's not, but China's headed for a period of maybe some sustained stagnation, which is a very different way, economic stagnation, which is a very different way of thinking about China for over the next 10 to 15 years. Strategically, would this be a time that you would recommend to incoming presidents to lock in our gains, to somehow take advantage of the fact that China may be back on its feet a little bit, or how would you think about that?
Well, I think a lot of China's economic statistics are interesting fiction reading. I don't doubt the obvious economic gains over the past several decades, but I think a lot of their statistics are still on the old communist system. If People's Widget Factory 47 is told to produce 1,000 widgets in a year, by God, it'll produce 1,000, or maybe it'll produce 1,100. Whether they work or not is a different story. And I think that confusion permeates a lot of what we hear about them. Interesting, I guess it was a typographical error that their carbon emissions turned out to be 17% greater than previously reported. I mean, that's just got lost in the shuffle there somehow. So I don't really have a strong sense whether China is entering into a period of stagnation, much different from what they've been doing for quite some time, just not reported accurately. I think it's not so much that China's military and strategic thinking has not been affected so much by their economic circumstances in the past several years as by the perception of American weakness. I think if we had a Navy of something approximating the size it should be that was closer to the coast of East and Southeast Asia as it should have been for a long time, they wouldn't be building islands on these rocks and reefs in the South China Sea. And they wouldn't be taking steps in the East China Sea. I think this is a correctable misimpression, but as in any circumstance where the calculus of one side looking at another is out of whack from the reality, and in particular misapprehending the basic capabilities and resolve of the United States, you are increasing the risk of inadvertent conflict. So I think the new president has a very difficult job of recreating the structures of deterrence that have fallen into disrepair, not just in East and Southeast Asia, but as Senator Sullivan intimated earlier, really around the world. And to do that, to get them back into place, not to accept as a new normal the hole that we've dug ourselves the last 7 years, but to get back to where we were before without finding ourselves in conflicts that we're not seeking, but that this disconnect in perceptions has allowed to arise over the past 7 years. I think it's important to do it quickly, and I completely agree with what Senator Sullivan said about using our network of allies in the region. We are in a classic political science offshore balancing role, and we haven't been balancing. And I think there isn't anybody else who's going to perform that role in the near term, and if we don't get back in this game soon and seriously, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to fix.
Great. Well, I hope somebody, I'm going to open it up to questions, and Ambassador Bolton, you have a stop at 2 o'clock, do you too? Or
I think I got a little
a
flex
little
on
more
that.
time. So if
I'll try and stay.
hopefully somebody will ask the following question, which is, Senator Sullivan, how would we explain to the American people the need and the resources necessary? You don't have to answer this, I'm just hoping to put it out there. The American people the need to reestablish and pay for our structures of deterrence. But, you know, please ask a question and a succinct one, as well as identify yourself, because we don't have that much time. So, over here.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai. Just moved to Washington, D.C. from California, member of Reagan Foundations in California. Ambassadors, thank you for talking about North Korea and unification and China and so forth. That's one of the two issues we have in the Asia Pacific. My concern is now South Korea is becoming friendly with China. My question is it going to be advantage for China to get close to North Korea?
Thank you.
In terms of nuclear.
Well, I think China has clearly allowed this nuclear weapons program to proceed for the reasons I said before. They could stop it. I think one reason I think it's actually in China's interest to work toward the reunification of the peninsula, which is obviously a historical aberration, is that their influence over a reunited Korea is going to be very substantial. I think what they're worried about is us being on the Yalu River. They saw that movie in the 1950s. They didn't like it then. They don't like it now. Fortunately, we don't want to be on the Yalu River. We want to be in Busan, where we've got mobility there and in the broader region. So I think there's a deal there if we could, but it won't be easy to achieve. I just think the elimination of the North Korean regime, hopefully through the peaceful reunification of the peninsula, is such an enormous plus for us and for everybody else in the world that I'm prepared to accept that American influence over a reunited Korea may not be what it once was. I'm not so worried because I don't think our influence over South Korea is what it once was. And to get rid of North Korea, I'd be prepared to make that trade-off.
Senator Sullivan, on that point, would you agree that our long-standing policy, our longer-term strategy, should be a peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, or how should we think about that?
Well, look, I think it's again to Ambassador Bolton's great credit, the fact that he is bringing up an issue today that he's correct has not really been a focus of much discussion. Certainly not much in terms of a kind of a strategic emphasis, and it's a huge challenge. But it's not only a national security challenge what North Korea represents. It is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in the world, and it always gets overlooked. It always gets overlooked. You'll see an article once every 6 months, maybe, if that, about how this regime is literally destroying its own people. And yet the rest of the world kind of just looks away. And we don't do that in a lot of places in the world, but we've been conditioned to just to look away. I clearly think a peaceful unification of the North Korean Peninsula is what our allies in Korea are focused on. I will mention, though, when you get out in the region sometimes and you're asking the questions in terms of our allies and their commitment and the rebalance, one of the things that I noticed the last time I was out in the region, we are moving forces. Now, I think, to your non-question question, that we should be significantly increasing defense spending. I voted against the budget deal that came out a couple weeks ago for a whole host of reasons, but one of the main reasons was I think it dramatically undercut what we need in a very challenging world right now from a defense spending perspective. It didn't even meet what the Obama administration budget was. For this year and next year, it's much less. So I think we need to do a lot more in that regard. One thing that is interesting, though, that again doesn't get a lot of press, is that in terms of where we're moving our different forces, particularly with regard to the Koreans and the Japanese, in different parts of the Asia Pacific, Marines moving to Guam and to Hawaii and to Australia, soldiers in Korea moving and having bases reestablished, an enormous amount of military work going on in Guam and on parts of mainland Japan. Typically that has been military spending that the United States has paid for. In the amount of money in terms of what is projected to be spent by the rebalance, which is mostly positive, in both Korea, Japan, and Guam, the number is close to about $38 billion. The Koreans and the Japanese are paying for about $31 billion of that. So we talk a lot about burden sharing, particularly with regard to our European allies. And this is an example, in my view, of our allies, critical allies in the region, stepping up. Interestingly enough, the Japanese are focused on I think the number's over $3 billion on Guam in terms of military spending. Think about that. That is spending on U.S. territory by an ally of ours for U.S. military bases, U.S. military training. That's an indication of a pretty strong alliance, both in terms of commitments, not only by the Japanese, but by the Koreans. And to me, that's an important thing to recognize.
That's a large number. I wasn't aware of that. Over here.
Thank you very much. Raghuveer Goy. I'm with India Globe in Asia Today. Two quick questions. One, Fortune 500 companies and also many think tanks in India and here think, and including that the new government of Prime Minister Modi, he is a business-minded Prime Minister ever India had today. And Washington is looking at him, and what he's saying is make in India and do business with India. My question is here, what is the future of U.S.-India economic and economic relations, and also what do you think about this triangle, U.S., China, India, and U.S., China, Pakistan, and so how do you compete? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, look, I think the opportunities, and I kind of hinted at it, between the U.S. and India and our relationship are very significant. And, the Prime Minister was just in the country recently. Didn't come to Washington, interestingly enough. Stayed on the West Coast, I believe, where all the tech companies are. And as a senator, I certainly plan on getting over there next year and trying to understand that relationship better. But I think the interest in India deepening its relationships with not only the United States, but you read about Japan, you read about Australia. These are enormous opportunities. I also think there's something going on domestically in the United States, which is very exciting. You see the rise of the Indian American community in terms of one of our newest groups of immigrants that have done very well in this country. And you see this group of Americans who are starting to become much more engaged in politics, much more engaged in terms of the political process. And if you look historically, that can also help drive an interest in overseas relations. So I'm very bullish on the opportunities for a much more strategic relationship between the United States and India.
Thank you. Ambassador Bolton, did you have the last word? I know you had to.
Well, just on that score, I think we have every reason to try and increase economic and political relations with India. And I think the opportunities are there. I don't share the view that we are inevitably close allies with India because we're both democracies. India is a great power, and it hasn't behaved like that in recent years for all kinds of historical reasons. But it's not going to have any choice in the coming decades. It's not going to have any choice. Among other things, they don't call the region to India's east and China's south Indochina for nothing. And I think from the U.S. perspective, maintaining and protecting our interests, trying to reduce conflicts, but also containing assertive and potentially belligerent policies by any country in the region is going to require some pretty astute political thinking. I think one of the things our former boss, George W. Bush, did that has not been fully understood is that for the first time, I think he decoupled U.S.-Indian relations from U.S.-Pakistani relationships. It was always a zero-sum game historically. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that's very important because we've got to have an adequate relationship with Pakistan itself as a nuclear power and one that's constantly at risk of being overtaken by extremists, and because peace on the Indian subcontinent is so important for everybody. So I think there's a lot that we should be doing there from a U.S. perspective, but I don't think it's necessarily a bed of roses. I think this is a difficult, complex relationship that we need to work at.
How much more time do you have? I'm gonna look.
I think 5 more minutes? Yeah.
Okay, let me just.
One-
Derek has written a lot about
Yeah.
the potential for India
Right.
to be a partner, but just the stasis and the economic reforms of
Right.
India.
So
go ahead. Okay, thank you.
Take off on what the senator said about the U.S. and apply it to India. If our strategic options in Asia are expanded with our economy doing well, the same thing is true several times over for India because India is potentially in a takeoff period. India is going to do okay. That's not the issue. India's going to do okay for the next 10 or 15 years. The question is whether they will do extremely well. That's also possible. And so if you think, as I do, and I think all of us do, that a really thriving, prosperous India is good for the United States. Doesn't mean that we agree on everything. It's not good in every particular, but overall it's good for the United States. Then the key is India getting its economic act together. And with a large economy like India, that's always about internal changes. It's not about U.S.-India economic relations. It's not about particular business interests. It's about fundamental reform within India. And so I'm repeating a little bit what I said, but to your point about the strategic triangles and handling and how these relationships evolve, the key thing is for India to make the necessary economic reforms internally. And then the strategic situation improves both from India's perspective and also from America's perspective.
Question over here. No longer. I saw another one.
He works for me. That would be cheating.
Oh, I guess he was signaling the time.
Oh, okay.
I didn't
No.
read the baseball.
One more.
Thank you very much. Jennifer Chen, reporter with Shenzhen Media Group. I have one question to Senate. You know, the chairman of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee has called on the Pentagon to clarify publicly the legal intent of the U.S. patrol last month near an island China has built in the South China Sea. Do you agree with him? And what's your take on it? Is there any response from the Pentagon? Thank you very much.
It's a good question,
Yeah.
but let me kind of put my own. I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I think it's hard to get a sense of exactly what the administration is trying to accomplish in this freedom of navigation
Yeah.
mission. Whether it is purely freedom of navigation, and I think part of the message has been muddled by the administration itself.
Yes.
Whether there is an actual challenge to the territories that China has claimed, or what's your sense of all that, and what would you like more clarity on?
Well, it's a great question, and I'll kind of back up here. Again, I mentioned the meetings that we had out in Singapore, and that was an example. I think you saw the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the Secretary of Defense, a number of senators, both Republicans and Democrats, kind of out at this conference together, where all the major defense ministers in the region gather every year. And we were purposely making a showing of us kind of being together, right? Kind of, as I mentioned, I believe historically, if you look, U.S. national security and foreign policy is at its strongest anywhere in the world when the executive and legislative branches are working together. And that hasn't been the case for a number of years, but the potential in the Asia-Pacific is significant. So Secretary Carter gave a very strong speech, and he said, we will fly, sail, operate anywhere that international law allows us. And then he added, building up a submerged island does not provide you sovereignty. Okay, that's pretty strong. What we worried about then, what I worried about, what Senator McCain worried about, was that, as I mentioned, this would become kind of another Syria red line type of exercise. A strong statement by a senior official on a policy matter that a lot of countries were watching and wondering about. And then no follow-through. So both in private meetings with senior defense and civilian officials and in public hearings, and this was an oversight role I think that the Congress played a good role in, we were encouraging them to follow through. Not to be belligerent, but to not lose additional credibility. The irony is that once they did that, once the USS Lawson, I believe,
Lawson, yeah.
went within the 12-mile radius of the Subi Reef. So inside of that, we were having an armed services hearing, and the Secretary of Defense was there. It was literally hours, I believe, after it happened. We were reading about it in news reports. So when I asked the question of what happened, what the ramifications were, what we were trying to, some of you may have seen it, the Secretary avoided the question. He didn't want to answer the question. It took the chairman of the committee to essentially pull it out of him, saying, hey, we're reading about this in the paper. We've all been discussing it. It's a big issue. Why won't you actually pronounce what you did, give us clarity on it, and help clarify U.S. strategy and policy? So that was a bit of a disappointment that when they finally did the right thing, they didn't want to articulate it. They didn't even want to publicly state it, even though obviously some Pentagon officials had backgrounded several news media outlets a couple hours before. So I think that caused muddle, certainly. And it also made it look like we weren't, not that we should have been proud of it, but that we somehow were almost trying to hide from it. That's not a good message to send. So what we have been doing, a number of us, I and a couple other senators wrote the president and said, look, this is an important step, but what we need to do is we don't need to make this so dramatic. We need to just do this routinely. This is the freedom of navigation that has kept the peace and the commerce throughout the world, led by the United States of America for over 70 years, and we do this routinely everywhere. And we should continue to do it routinely in this part of the world. By the way, China has dramatically benefited from all of this over the course of decades. the free-flowing commerce throughout the world. So it's to their advantage that we don't have any kind of conflict in the region. And hopefully do it with allies. And by the way, there's a precedent. I had mentioned earlier, in my remarks, in 1996, there was a big, what was later referred to as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. And I'm sure many of you know what that was. And the president, at the time, President Clinton, sent 2 carrier battle groups to the region, which was a show of American resolve. But what also happened during that time, there was a big debate whether or not we should send a naval ship through the Taiwan Strait. China was claiming that was internal waterways. We disagreed. And we hadn't done that in many, many years. And we did. And I happen to have been one of the Marines on this very large ship that did that. And I remember it very well. But the story that has occurred after, you don't hear a lot about, because we've done that on a regular basis. And it's not a dramatic issue anymore, because it's routine. And I think that's where we need to go with these freedom of navigation operations, because they benefit not just us, they benefit the region. In my view, they benefit China. And if they become routine, and we have strong ally support for it, it won't be the big deal that it's been made of, in part because we were taking so long to act.
Thanks, Senator. I think you have to go.
Yeah.
And we'd like to thank you so much, not just for coming here today, but for really taking up these issues of the Asia Pacific, which we so badly need in this country, and this small group of senators, new senators who are taking up these issues with great interest, I think will be of enormous benefit to our country. So thank you.
Right. Thank you very
Derek.
much.
Okay,
Yeah.
take
All
care.
right, Derek.
Good to see you again.
And I look forward to coming back.
Absolutely. Standing invitation.
Okay. Thank you. Good to see you again.
All right.